OpenAI had this model that came out at the end of last year. It was probably benchmarked as in the top 100,000 of competitive human software developers. By the end of the year, a couple of months later, it was number 171 out of these competitive software developers. So it's improving really rapidly. And my experience is that we've gone beyond a graduate analyst when using these tools. They are much, much more sophisticated. And you can also get much higher quality outputs from them. So I don't think it's worth asking a large language model, generative AI system, what's the capital of France? But that's the wrong way to go. What you can do is ask much, much harder questions, and then you get quite surprising answers.
Welcome back to Navigating Nerds. It's a great pleasure to speak today to Azeem Azhar, the author of The Exponential Age. Would you tell listeners a little bit about yourself, some of your background briefly before we get going? I know there's a lot to talk about on AI and media's reckoning and how we're trying to make sense of this.
There is so much to talk about, but it's great to be on the show and really excited by what Jonathan, you and the team are building. I have some familiarity with this space because I remember some 20 years ago when I was running a group at Reuters, looking at how we could source unique information around cocoa crops or onion prices in India, or get a sense of how much oil was being moved around the world by taking photos of tankers as they left ports. So there's always been this sense that, of course, there's a lot of alpha, a lot of edge in getting unconventional data. And that was really just part of my journey, having worked really in the internet space since 1994. I actually built my first websites in 94, but the first thing I ever built and put online was on an FTP site, if you can believe that. Yeah.
That's a little bit older than my generation. Yeah.
Yes, but those protocols still work. I mean, FTP is still a useful thing to have. But in that 30 years, I've been able to observe what really matters in technology. So when I got started, what really mattered was the internet, and everything from content to applications to the networks, the physical hardware was something you had to master if you wanted to go online and read something or publish something. And it's that edge that excites me. So there's a whole slew of the internet and the tech industry that I never really got to grips with, like e-commerce, because by the time those companies were interesting, the technology problem had moved on. And so, of course, in the last 8 or 9 years, the vast bulk of my focus has been on AI. But again, it is a sort of full stack question. Everything from what are the chips you need? What is the electricity that you need to power those chips? What is the data? Of course, so much about that. And how good are these models and what can we do with them?
Yeah, well, that was kind of one thing I really wanted to talk to you about here, was just like, so there are a lot of claims about what AI is doing, what it can do, what is it just about to be doing. And this is maybe a little confusing of a question, and I apologize for that. But it's like, how would you advise people who don't know a lot about it, who are trying to come to grips with it? Like, what would be like the 3 things they should, like, mentalities or questions that they should ask every time to try to understand what's going on with AI?
It is so confusing. There's just so much that is happening, and lots of narratives get commingled from the notion of these big existential risks to all of us losing our jobs, to all of us living a life of leisure. I think of the AI tools that we have today, and when I say that, I really think about the large language models that are often in chatbots like Claude or ChatGPT. That's really what we mean in the common vernacular by AI. And I tell people that, look, the way to work with something like this is, imagine you've got a really smart analyst who's maybe got a master's degree. So that smart analyst can go off, they can read the internet, they can do analysis, they can do research for you, and they can come back with that information. It's not always going to be right because they're human and they've only just graduated with their masters in history or business administration, and you would never trust what they told you sight unseen and go and act on it, but you'd use it as something quite useful. So I think of these tools as not just one of these graduate level analysts, but many dozens, hundreds of them, who I can throw all sorts of different types of problems at. Even things that might have taken me 10, 15, 20 Google searches to get to the answer. I could now use one of these tools, and my graduate analyst in a box sitting somewhere in a data center in the US or in Europe will go away and come back with an answer, which increasingly is going to be the one that I was after.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a very similar answer to I asked a very similar question to Vivian Ming, one of our previous guests, neuroscientist and entrepreneur. And she advised to like look at it as your graduate research assistant.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
okay, so they know something, and their judgments about salience, about like how to do it, how to communicate it, aren't well honed, but they have this like raw information about it.
I love her that framing. The What I would say about these graduate analysts in a box is sometimes they really surprise us, and sometimes they produce whatever the highest grade is, an A star or 4.0, and we're blown away. But the other thing that's happening that makes it this area quite complicated is the rate of improvement is really significant. And to give you a data point, the AI companies, for a variety of reasons, have really focused on helping these tools become good at writing software. And OpenAI had this model that came out at the end of last year. It was probably benchmarked as in the top 100,000 of competitive human software developers. By the end of the year, a couple of months later, it was number 171 out of these competitive software developers. So it's improving really rapidly. And my experience is that we've gone beyond a graduate analyst when using these tools. They are much more sophisticated, and you can also get, um, depending on how you use them, you can get much higher quality outputs from them. So I don't think it's worth asking a large language model, generative AI system, what's the capital of France?
Yeah.
Right, that's the wrong way to go. What you can do is ask much harder questions, and then you get quite surprising answers.
Yeah, I find that asking them a question. So sometimes like when I work with a student, whether it's like a very like in my role at Harvard's Human Flourishing program, that when I ask a very complicated question, I don't really even know how to form the question yet. It's really the results are pretty poor with the student. I've got to like really think through it. But with some of these, I can send into something, and then there's a refinement process with it that has been really helpful on
Oh,
it.
so have you found that if you send in like an unstructured, half thought baked
Yeah.
idea, the AI is able to turn it into some form of sense?
Well, like their responses are helpful to moving me to it. It's something of like, um, it's not exactly giving me everything I need, but it's giving me enough for me to move on my thinking to that next stage, to that next stage, to that next stage. And so there's a co-reasoning process. I think it's doing fairly well. It's not, even though sometimes on these new models, it's telling us it's reasoning, it is doing something to put out, to generate an output with which a co-reasoning process can be quite successful.
Yes, I think that co-reasoning is a really great way to talk about it. The sense that to go from a problem that you may not articulate particularly well to a good articulation, through to some investigation, to some set of analyses or conclusions, is a really multi-step problem. It's not something that's ever achieved in a single Google search, and if you live in that space, you know that it's a process that takes hours. And I do find that those intermediate steps that come from the AIs can be incredibly helpful. Where I've had an experience that's perhaps different to yours is that I can send in, I'm going to use a very English word here, I can send in total gibberish into my LLM, that means total nonsense. It means words, sentences that are half formed. Maybe like chatting to your friend after they've had 7 too many beers, and it can turn that into my intent. It's so clever, given the data that it's leaning on, to be able to go off and do that. And that has actually been one of my one of the really great productivity hacks that I've had from using large language models. So I'm one of these people who is fizzing with half-baked ideas. And I'm fizzing with them, and I can't close the loops, and it gets in the way of my productivity. Well, no more. I have this half-baked idea. I talk to Claude in the audio mode. It turns it into a semi-baked idea. It's out of my head. It's stuck in the history of Claude. I can go back to it if I want to do something with it. And I just get these things out of my head much, much more quickly. And for me personally, and other people's experience will be different, that's saved me a few hours a week, because I just turn it off and I gave it to the machine, and the machine did something with it.
So, I mean, there's a lot of questions about like the continuity of this technology with other types of technology. It seems like something a little bit different is going on here. Like we're like like sometimes technology. Like, one helpful way that I think about technology is technologies extend human intelligence in that way. And so it's that like one of the human intelligence is like what we can do with our hands, right? And so a lot of machines were made to do things. What we can do with our feet, machines are kind of doing, the mobility. Just like that is kind of something that technology has extended that human intelligence there. And now we're talking about things that have like there's these human intelligence in like more of like the normal sense of the word, like producing ideas, thoughts, words. Do you see this in continuity with those early ones, or do you think that there's like this is kind of a new type? And this is beside the question that you've written a lot on, and like the exponential growth and change on things, but just like where we are today, is that just like can we say like, oh, this is similar to those other ones, or is this something different because we are now dealing with this central case of intelligence, not like bodily intelligence in the sense of like what I can do with my body?
I mean, it's such an interesting way that you've framed it. Is it continuity, or is it a step change? And I think about Justice Potter Stewart at times like this. I couldn't tell you which it is, but I'll know it when I see it. It feels like a step change to us. But here's the argument for it being continuity. The argument for it being continuity is that there isn't really anything that an LLM could do that a million people running around and working more slowly with access to all the books and sort of the web couldn't somehow do. I mean, that would be the argument one would make. But you do get qualitative differences in the way a system works across phase changes. So what's the difference between liquid water and steam? They're the same chemical, but they behave completely differently. You take different safety precautions for them. You use them for different things. Sure, you can use water and steam to clean things, but I'd much rather you use steam to clean the scalpel you're about to cut me with than a bit of running water. And you would never drink steam, but you would drink water. So you do see, even when you have kind of continuous processes, moments of phase change where something behaves radically different. And I think we are seeing that with large language models. I think as they get more and more sophisticated, they're doing things that defy the language, the framing, the semantics that we might have used before. And it's a bit like, sure, what's the difference between a horse-drawn cart and a Lamborghini, right? They both transfer people from A to B, but there's something that's qualitatively different about them. And I do think that we have reached a new set of tools that work in a very, very different way. And I notice this in my day-to-day work, in the way in which I now research questions, I inform myself, I challenge my thinking. This is not me using a search engine 100 times faster than I ever would before.
Yeah, I think that's the difficulty, like, even that I'm having right now is trying to figure out, like, what it is. I know and this is kind of the things, like, I sometimes know more about what to do than I know how to think about it. And sometimes it doesn't matter, what I think about it because I know what to do with it on it. And I think that's, like, but this produces something of a quandary, I think, for people sometimes outside of technology who try to write about it. They have to have some conceptualization of it. And I and I guess that's, like, something I was kind of, like, intrigued by some of, like, one of, like, your 2 problems that you've written about, like, in just, like, the AI conversation. One was, which I think is, like, spot on, is that, like, we can't think about this as being somewhat, like, independent of humanity. Like, humans are still building, and there's, like, something it's, like, it's building, it's not a neutral, thing. The other thing was that, like, there's a lot of people commenting on it that for one reason or another, they haven't really taken the time to really understand the technology on it, but it seems to be increasingly important, and that those people do kind of adequately communicate to a broader public what's going on with this technology on it. And I'm kind of wondering, like, what would be your advice to this maybe not the seasoned technology reporter who, like, knows all the people, gets involved, not the Kara Swishers of the world, right? It's the people who are kind of breaking in, or the people who now see some of these, like, ripping across a national security world, and they're trying to understand it. What would be your advice to them to, like, "Okay, here's how you should think about this new technology," and I think you're right, like, let's focus on that LLM driven products.
Well, I think you have to separate out the raw technology from the individuals who have founded the companies, taken the airtime, to and are talking about it publicly. I mean, I think the technology is now out of the bag, and if someone turned off the electricity to OpenAI into Anthropic, this technology would still be being built by thousands of people around the world. And so you have to separate that out from questions you might have about about power, about capital accumulation, about whether this is a technology of a class that is desirable for there to be a land grab around. Those are all really important questions. But I think that if people start, and I think a lot of non-expert writers start from that lens of a political analysis of the technology without really understanding perhaps what it is, how it works, and how to make use of it. I mean, so I think the first thing is it's not that you're saying these questions aren't important, but they're separate questions. And then I think you have to go into a rough understanding of why the technology works. And it's really come out of a long, long tradition of how computer scientists try to make sense of natural language and text, which is a multi-decade long project. One of the reasons I think I was able to get a lot of use out of LLMs from the very early days was that I understood that this wasn't about factuality and word after word after word. I always viewed it as um, a way of inspecting the concepts that underpin the writing that we see, we write ourselves, and we read. I mean, there are two ways of saying something that are kind of in a way semantically very similar. Um, Jonathan is an academic at Harvard, and Jonathan is an academic at Oxford University. Now, one is wrong. The Oxford one is wrong, but semantically they're the same. It is, here is a person, they have this role at a particular class of higher education university. And having worked in the information retrieval and search and natural language space for probably a decade or so, we were often trying to understand things conceptually rather than just think about them from a a word match basis. Back 20 years ago, you had the problem of synonyms, that what you might call football, I would call soccer, or no, it's the other way around. You call it soccer, I call it football, and you're looking for things I've written about soccer, but I've written nothing about soccer. I've written loads of things about football, but the concept is the same. And so 20 years ago, one of the big ideas was, can the computers understand the core semantic concepts from learning from the data rather than being taught them explicitly? And so once you approach a large language model like that and you say, I'm actually not so interested about about factual errors. Did Jonathan go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton? I'm interested in the fact that conceptually and categorically, it's taking me in the right direction, and that becomes really relevant, and it becomes really relevant at the earliest stages of when you're doing an analysis. You're trying to understand something. You're trying to understand who's a protagonist, who's an antagonist, what were the power relationships within them, what the temporal dynamics. Well, these are all concepts that are independent of the exact words. And I think when I sort of figured that out and started to use the large language models that way, I started to get, have quite a lot of success in helping my work. Not, by the way, in helping my fact checking. I still had to do that by hand, and still do that by hand.
Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful and insightful in this way, is that like kind of taking out that the veracity of it, and segmenting that out. And I think there's been a lot of focus on that. And I think that some of it, quite frankly, comes into like just definitions of intelligence we've inherited on it. Basically, this kind of it's an old scientific notion, like tradition of positivism there, and that, and like segmenting this out, that it's kind of helping to think through. And actually, one of our jobs can still be this kind of entering that factuality and checking that on it, and we kind of like switch the two roles.
But factuality is getting so much better
Yeah.
on these systems. I mean, I think there's a benchmark of the rate of hallucinations that the large language models produce, and you see the kind of classic order of magnitude improvement as you go from from GPT-3 through to GPT-4 and the things beyond. And of course, the new tools that have this anchoring in references. So these are deep research or deep search or the perplexity piece tend to be able to footnote and evidence the claims that they're making. And that, by the way, doesn't mean that they are necessarily reliably excellent tools. I did a perplexity search earlier today, and I asked a really, really specific question about it was about dynamics of data centers and permissioning and so on, and I got back an approximate answer, what I would call a 10,000-foot answer to my highly specific question, and then a whole load of unrelated information. And back to our graduate student analogy, it reminded me of a grad student being given a very specific assignment by their professor, Professor Teubner, and they boiled the ocean and they didn't answer the question directly, and you've had to write B- on the essay and said, great efforts, hard work, would have been more efficient for you to directly answer the question. And so that still happens with these tools, because they kind of are these probabilistic systems, and they do sometimes kind of wander astray. But I would say the rate with which that happens is diminishing. The speed of the tools is getting faster. And the fact that I could even do that and reject it for being analytically too weak is quite remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be quite honest, like I still like in research I do and writing, I engage as like who wouldn't use one of these tools right now? It'd be like bizarre to like at this point. But like I still will fact check it. Like when I say like, oh, I need some references to this, find me some. And what I find is it's getting better. It's more approximating. It actually still, there are still some hallucinations about like, I want to know, like, oh, find me some of these articles from like a colleague of mine that I know has written on it. And they're very similar sounding. but they're not the actual ones, but you can use that to then go find it, find the exact one. So there's still this like iterative process, and that's that. And what's like that layer there that's I think going to be the hardest is the trust layer. And that's something where like the technology could keep moving forward, but if that and if there's still this doubt, if there's still this lack of trust, that's going to inhibit it from like being all that it kind of wants to be on it. And I don't know, but that's the, solving the trust thing isn't always a technological answer. And I think as technologists, we sometimes think there's a technological solution to it. And I think there's probably a non-tech, there needs to be a non-technological solution to, actually establishing trust in these tools. And that hasn't really been worked on.
Yes. Oh, okay. Look, I totally agree with you that you need to have non-technological approaches to building trust. You also have to have systems that deserve that trust.
Yeah, sure.
So
Yeah.
I don't want you trusting an LLM that is giving you the wrong references or making up academic papers. And to your point that you're using LLMs that are anchoring their results in footnotes, which are then made up, right? This is a huge issue. So I think the other issue is the amount of time I have used these tools is somewhat absurd. It's an incredibly steep learning curve. So what you actually have on the trust question is a tool that looks like it's really easy to use, but in fact is really hard to use. And that I think is a funny position to get to. And I deal with hallucinations all the time, but I'm expecting them. So I asked the one of the deep research tools to come up with a full environmental load, water, carbon dioxide, methane, pollution, other types of things, of about 20 day-to-day activities, from watching a Super Bowl match to going to Disneyland to going to Lollapalooza to doing this to doing that. And it went away for about 70 minutes and it came back with a really, really good grid for these 15, 20 activities, 10 criteria, so a couple of hundred data points, all referenced. I now have to go through each of those individually, right? But that process to get there would have taken me well over a couple of days of sitting down and doing that work, and it took 60 minutes. I went off and did something else in the time. So you have to understand it. This is your point about the co-researcher. This is someone who's with you alongside, but I can't trust it to do that. The fact that I can't trust it to do that means that I can't automate that process. It means I have to put resources in, and so that in a way kind of gates the speed at which it can operate. But what happens when I can trust that, Jonathan? What do you think then happens? Like, what's the outcome of that high level of trust?
Well, I think at that point you start to see the actual productivity gains that are actually that are being promised, that like we see the possibility for, because you can maybe like move forward really quickly. And I found this, and you get to know certain tools, you get to know where they are, like the differences between chat and Claude and things like that. And so but just you're getting to know specialties of like a graduate student, like, oh, this graduate student, I'm going to ask him that, versus this student's like, oh, they're not going to really know that, they might give me an answer on it. So it's like, so there's a little bit of that, and so but with each of them, and in anyone who's dealing with a student knows that this is a quite kind of, this is a very laborious process, teaching there. You don't enter education thinking I'm going to like live the most like efficient, high productive life, because you're dealing with people trying to get them at the same level as you are. That's the goal at the end. And so like when these tools are still like needing to be checked and needing to do this, that's that's bringing in a lot of time there on it. But once that trust is established and you can just start doing it, and that's when like the productivity gains are going, and such that, and I always kind of think about technology in like there's one part that's technical that's like, how are we building certain capabilities? That, and some of that has like automating tasks and other things on it. But actually, how are we embedding this in processes and bringing along users to make sense of it, to like build trust in it, and all of those is that like those really ideally are like parallel developments. And I think actually we're not like we sometimes like do one without the other on it. And sometimes the big companies don't really help themselves as well because they're not really adept at building trust out in the world because they're really brilliant at sometimes one thing on it. And I think those are the ways in which the technology needs to develop is both in the social technology as well as the actual hard technology that we focus on right now.
Social technologies take a long time to mature and develop. That was the message of the first book, The Exponential Age. It was this idea of the exponential gap that emerges between uh, a great team of developers who can come up with a new digital widget that we all love, and gets better and better and better because of Moore's law and other things, and the rate with which people can sit around and get together and agree to change their norms or to insist those norms get applied to the device in question. And social technologies will always, I came to a conclusion maybe after I'd written the book, that they will always lag, and they will lag because you actually need evidence of the system in the field to understand what its impact will be. And I think a really great example is, which is close, I think, probably to some of the work that you now do, is the view of social media around the time of the Arab Spring, right? So in 2010, 2011, social media was amazing. It was like everyone gets a voice, and it roots around authority, and everyone who was remotely progressive was delighted about it. And then Obama used social media, and Obama used social media, and now it is God, and especially in large parts of the US. And then by 2016, another guy used social media, and won an election, and now social media became the bad thing. And at the same time, we were starting to see that kids were maybe not expressing themselves the way we expected them to. And of course, Jonathan Haidt has written a lot about this, and people have their own individual stories about this question. And in my book, I write about the arrival of the iPhone being an example of the exponential gap, because my family, so I'm a dad, I've got 3 kids, we didn't have rules about whether you use a phone or not at dinner time, because I didn't grow up with them, because we didn't have phones back then. And so you get to this interesting point where, well, which version of social media or the iPhone are we talking about? Are we talking about the one that people were excited about, and certain people, right, Democrats are excited about in 2012 after the Arab Spring and uh, Obama, or the one of 2018, 2 years into Trump's first presidency, where that same group was sort of upset about it, and the kind of the teen mental health crisis was emerging. And so, in some sense, the technologies have to play out in their interactions in society, so that we can understand, what's going to be good about them, or what's going to be more problematic about them. And ultimately, at some point there's just a disagreement as well, right? About whether you liked it or not.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful for people to like actually remember that like actually it's there's something that's good about our disagreements and getting clarity around them, and like knowing like we know more about what we need to be asking these of the technology, of ourselves, of our society, of these things is like a thing about it is like, and sometimes we're like often like trying to like find where's that one agent, whether it's a company, a person, to like place the blame on. But it's like the ecosystem is bearing this. And we've got to kind of like keep adjusting that on it. And the like I think it's great what like Height's doing. Someone who I've interacted with a bunch, Sherry Turkle, at MIT. I think like all that work is like super good And it's like stuff that we should be encouraging, so we know more, and particularly as technologists. And is that like we need to keep that because we have a better sense about what the impact this is having on the ecosystem as a whole there on it. And so the more we learn about this, the more we can socialize that, the better our technology actually becomes. And it's in that sense in which, like, I don't know what you think about this. I know we're at the end of our time here. It feels like the conversation is just really beginning. Is that like that's kind of in a way that we're doing technological development a little bit differently right now, because we do have more exposure to social science, and you do have people in these companies trying to pay attention to it, and it does like there's more of that, and I think it's an exciting time to build technology with the Jonathan Haidts and Sherry Turkle's voices in your head right now,
Yeah.
and that seems different. I'm like,
Well, you have got many more voices
yeah,
in your head now than we did previously. I mean, I think about a lot of the debates that I wrote about in my in my book, and I write about in my newsletter. Uh, are often debates that have been a decade or more old amongst experts and participants. So questions about is technology neutral or not, has been thought about very heavily by philosophers and people from socio-technical studies for a long time. Questions around encryption and whether it's a right or not, around moderation and how you can moderate content. I mean, these are things which have got decades of scholarship, and also in the world before social media, when it was weblogs or blogs, these were essays and experts that were available, but the mainstream media was really not interested in it. I mean, in any meaningful sense, in saying these are the types of questions people should be caring about in 2003 or 2010 or 2016, right? Because everything was being painted with very, very bright colored paint, where there had to be a bad guy, when in reality there's a little bit of a nuance around it. And I think that there was a failure of those mainstream authorities in how they tooled themselves up to an audience that is much more well connected, is one click away from good or bad information, has high levels of education than it ever has. And so I think we get into this space where and this is the work that I do. I have a newsletter which has an audience, it has a community. I'm absolutely not a journalist. I write what I like. I invest in companies I write about. I'm active in the ecosystem. I have a perspective. My readers know that I have a perspective and I have failings, and I have foibles, and I'm open-minded in some things and not in others, which was not how we had the relationship with the media certainly a decade or 15 years ago. I mean, I think that's clearly changed in the last 2 or 3 years, and that inversion, not inversion, that change, I think, we hasn't settled down. We don't really know exactly what the configuration will be when the dust settles. But there are so many more accessible, brilliant voices about any topic that are now available that weren't 7 or 8 years ago. And I think that's not yet a great thing, but I imagine it could become a very good thing.
yeah, I mean, it, I hope it does. It kind of sometimes, but there is, just this superabundance of it right now, and the efforts to try to get like post real like legacy small number of major media outlets kind of authority and gatekeeping right now are quite poor on it, and such that like how to filter through it, how to find those voices, how to do it that aren't just like luck of the draw. What I
But
found.
but trust scores have been falling, particularly in Western Europe and the US, towards the media for a really, really long time. And I think we've reached. I'm not going to say it's the nadir of this, because I don't know how much further trust scores in the US could fall. But I think that the um, certainly amongst people who were the sort of kind of core supporters of Donald Trump, have absolutely lost faith in, almost to the point of pathologically losing faith in what the mainstream media might say, and that, by the way, will include, the Washington Post, given Jeff Bezos' sort of recent kind of commandeering of its editorial line. But I do think that there are still facts in the world, and facts in the world include, what did Nvidia say about their earnings in February 2025? That ends up being a fact in the world, and perhaps one of the things we have to do is we have to fall back to, almost like back to the castle, to where are the facts that are indisputable, so we can start to build some sense of trust over the top. I mean, I think it's a very, very challenging time, right? With with Musk changing how community notes work on X, with the degree of vitriol that we start to see, people whose minds can't be changed, on either side of the political spectrum. But I also think it may just be a transition process, because it's not sustainable actually for people in a complex society to sort of sit that far apart on matters of fact.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a great philosopher at Oxford, that Tom Simpson, who wrote his PhD on trust in the internet age, which was really great. And I commend this to, like, everyone. It's really, like, just pretty technical philosophy, but, like, one thing that he said was that, like, trust is is sometimes is, I think it was like, Tom will be upset if I get this wrong, but I think what I call is, it's a three-part relation, and it's like between two people exchanging about a third thing, and sometimes we're constantly trying to, like, remove a part at that, and such there is this, like, what's the actual claim and the veracity around a claim, that's the factual element, and what's the relational structure in what it is, and you're going to have to, like, maintain both of those. And, like, there are these things, facts out in the world, and they're actually, for the trust to be formed, they're going to be formed within these relational structures of exchanging about it. And I think a lot of the discourse around this has tried to really focus on that veracity element there, without attending to the much harder thing of the relational aspect of it. And in an internet age, that's going to be harder. But that's kind of the challenge for our age to some extent. And, we should be able to do hard things.
I mean, that is super interesting. You'll have to email me after the recording, the PhD. I will put it into an LLM to get a summary of the key arguments, of course. But 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 that is also a completely definite redefinition of where trust comes from. And I would say that the I don't think the mainstream media on any side has a completely unalloyed record on how they report, partly because they claim to report dispassionately, and then you sort of spot things that are not. I'm not talking about the New York Times and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or not, but I'm also talking about the depth of sourcing that might go on, or the level of uh, criticality that goes on into the thinking. These things, these publications. I think the New York Times, by the way, does a lot of work on its fact checking, but they're still rushing so much material out all of the time, and they don't stop to think. So I have one really nerdy example that really got my goat years ago, which was some British magazine or newspaper was talking about an exoplanet, it's a planet that's outside of the solar system, and they said, well, there's this, scientists have found a super dense planet. It's got twice the radius of Earth and 8 times the mass. Now, of course, because the volume of the planet goes by the cube of the radius, it's got 8 times the volume and it's got 8 times the mass, which means its density is identical to that of the Earth. And it was described as super dense by the journalist who wrote that, and he was obviously not doing any critical thinking when they wrote that. Had they been in your class, they would have had a few marks docked. And having worked in newsrooms many years ago in the early 90s, I sort of know even then the kind of pace that they were under. They're under much higher pace of work now, where, of course, there's absolutely fantastic reporting, writing, thinking that goes on. And it's not just in the mainstream, flagship titles. It's sort of all over. And there were great journalists who are super diligent about their thinking. But there's also a class of it where it's just about getting the newsprint out there so it can be turned into fish and chip wrap the next day. And to that extent, come bring this back to LLMs, right? It's also not too dissimilar to what we get out of the LLM, right? Sometimes it's absolutely phenomenal, and sometimes the thing just had to produce some tokens because we asked it to, and so it did. And it's really hard for the reader to sit there the whole time and say, how should I analyze this? Like, why does this matter? Does this really make sense? Do the assertions that are being made on paragraph 9 of this column align with the ones being made in paragraph 14, or indeed what's being said 4 pages away, or the equivalent on the website? I think that there is we've come from this challenging environment that at the moment is putting a lot of cognitive load on us as the reader.
Yeah, I mean that's a kind of maybe a good place to end. A sign, but yeah, I think it reminds me of something that was told to me early on in my graduate studies, and I talked to other people who come visit me about various things. Is that it's a lot of work. You have to pay attention.
Right.
And there's no it's like you have to do that. There's no easy route around it. And I think that's one thing that's always helpful to remind people with these technologies. Like, you got to stay engaged, keep your wits about you. And
so life's not going to be that easy after all, by the sounds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's really been a great pleasure to talk. Thank you very much for joining. How can our listeners? You have a fantastic, Substack there.
Yeah, if they just pop Exponential View into their search engine of choice, Bing, DuckDuckGo, even Google, you can find me. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, well, thank you very much. This has been great fun.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan.